You still will get a lot from today's workshop, I promise. All right, let's go ahead and start, and folks will just pick up where when they're able to get on. So thanks everyone so much for joining us today for this special presentation, which is co-hosted by BIRCH, which is the Behavioral and Implementation Research to Change Healthcare Center, and the BEAD Core, which provides a range of support services to GHU faculty. In the past year, we have expanded our qualitative research support services at the BEAD Core, and so it's exciting to see so much interest in today's topic. And please note, you can write to BEAD Core at jhmi.edu to learn more about our various services that we provide, and also to request services as well at any time. And I'll post that email in the chat momentarily. And so I'm Suzanne Grieb. I'm an assistant professor in the Center of Child and Community Health Research and a faculty lead for the qualitative research support with the BEAD Core. And then co-hosting today from BIRCH is Kristen Reichert, who is professor of medicine and director of the Johns Hopkins Adherence Research Center. And Kristen and I are very excited to welcome Dr. Suttiratana, or Dr. S, as I believe you often are called. And she's going to lead an introduction workshop on qualitative data analysis with NVivo. So Dr. S is a sociologist of health and illness who studies various sociocultural influences on health. She is a research faculty member at the Yale School of Public Health and currently serves as coordinator for the Cancer Disparities Firewall Project, which is a partnership between the Yale School of Public Health and the Yale Cancer Center. And she's also a core faculty member in the Yale School of Medicine's National Clinician Scholars Program, where she teaches and advises in the areas of community engaged research and qualitative research methods and practice. And so welcome, Dr. S, and thank you very much for joining us. And just quickly as a technical note, if you have questions as we move along, please post them in the chat. And at various points, we will go through and look at those, and Dr. S can respond to those. So thank you and welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So as mentioned already, in case a few people might have missed it, if you don't have access to NVivo today, it's okay. I will have some screenshots of NVivo. Some people prefer to work alongside the presentation. So either way works for me, as long as it works for you. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about coding and more using NVivo, and NVivo being a tool for qualitative data analysis. So while I'll focus on some of the mechanical and technical aspects of using NVivo, I may sprinkle in a little, a few of my own ideas about how to facilitate qualitative data analysis. So I'd like to cover how do you prepare data for NVivo, setting up NVivo, getting data into NVivo, as well as the basics of coding, including manipulating the nodes or codes that you create for various analytical purposes. And then I'll also introduce some of the more advanced visualization and exploratory data analysis tools that have been added to more recent versions of NVivo. So I do have PowerPoint slides that I'll share today, but there'll also be some hands-on views of NVivo. So just remembering that NVivo is a tool that we can use to help us answer or address research questions. It's important, as with any research, that you thoroughly understand what you're attempting to do with the tool before you embark on a project. So before you analyze any data using any software program, qualitative or quantitative, you should think about your research questions, any underlying theoretical frameworks or constructs, as well as what you're hoping to lay out for a future audience, be that in a manuscript or in another form of dissemination. So for people who are familiar with qualitative analysis, some of the qualitative analysis tips that I share may already be known, but for those who are just tipping into qualitative analysis or doing more mixed methods research, I just like to point out some of the ways that qualitative analysis may differ from quantitative analysis. One of the important things is once you begin analyzing and you've already collected your data, it often takes more time to actually go through the data. And sometimes people are thrown off by the amount of time that it actually takes to come up with something that you can present in a manuscript. And so I will share many of the slides that I have today that you can have as a handout after the talk, but I think it's important to keep in mind that much of your time in qualitative research is spent in this analysis phase where you're trying to make sense of your data and interpret it for an audience. So more technically, in preparing to use NVivo, there's some things that will help make the process much easier for you. So NVivo was originally designed to analyze text-based documents, and that's still, I think, its sweet spot. So word processing documents written on programs like Microsoft Word are preferred. So there's some other things that will help with the visual analysis and how your files work in the program once they're uploaded. So having pretty standard margins, not really small. I actually know people who like to have larger margins so that they can make notes, but having pretty standard margins, defined text styles can help. So making sure that if you have a transcript, you have headers and speakers identified. Not using text in tabular form in the word processing document. Making sure that the most important information or anything that you want to analyze as text is actually in the body of the document. Any track changes or comments and bubbles, footnotes, endnotes, all of that stuff disappears when you try to upload into NVivo. And then ethically speaking, it's important if you're using real data and you have decided that your work will be confidential or anonymous, that you change the name. You can change them to initials or pseudonyms, depending on your research protocol, but thinking about who has access to your version of NVivo and whether or not you're potentially breaching any ethical rules is something to consider. Now, NVivo is also able to analyze other types of files. PDF files, yes?
If everyone could please mute themselves, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
So PDF files work for combinations of text and images. You want to make sure that the PDF has been processed so that the text can be identified as readable text. That will ensure that you're able to code the text once you upload it in NVivo. For those who may be doing research on websites or in social media, there are actually ways that NVivo can capture information from websites and social media, and you can also analyze that within the NVivo platform. I won't spend a lot of time on that today, but there's a capability that exists. There are also integrations with programs that you may be more familiar with, like Excel, SPSS statistical software, and then survey platforms like Qualtrics. So the integrations help you move more seamlessly. There's some problems with some of the software. For mixed methods projects, for example, you may do some statistical analysis in SPSS, and bring your open-ended questions into NVivo for further analysis. So some other things to consider before you jump into NVivo. And the organization of our work as we move into NVivo necessarily helps drive our analysis. In the same way that theories may help guide our work, we may have some a priori themes that we'd like to see if they exist in our data. The way we organize our files will help determine the path of our analysis in NVivo. So some things that you'll want to consider are, what is a case for you? Is it an individual? Is it a single interview? If you're studying organizations, you might have multiple interviews, and the organization could be the case. And so thinking about how you intend to organize the case is something that's important to think about before you begin uploading files. Likewise, for each case, you may have one file, like an interview transcript, or you may have multiple files. If you're doing observations in a clinical setting, you may have notes from those observations. You may have a patient medical record abstract and an interview transcript. So thinking about what evidence you will be uploading for each case is also something to consider. And then just coming up with naming conventions that make sense to you as well as others working on the project. Now, when working in individuals as an individual versus a group, there are other things that you have to consider when working in NVivo. In the slides that I have today, I've tried to highlight in yellow things that are particularly important for groups to consider. So once you consider or start to think about coding, the size of your coding units for analysis is something that you should agree upon as a group. And this is important later for inter-rater reliability. But again, hopefully you can see how thinking through some of these things before you start to upload data into NVivo could be quite helpful. And then I'll talk a little bit about the project log when I move to the portion where we do some hands-on work in NVivo. But the project log is critical for teams or people working in groups because you're able to track everyone's activity in the software program. And if necessary, if you've made, say, daily or weekly backups, you're actually able to reset the file to an earlier point based on what you can see in the project log. So making sure that you have that log available is critical for groups. So when you first launch NVivo, and I understand that people are in different places in their access to NVivo, one of the other important things to do, and you may not do this in any other program that you use on your personal laptop or computer, but it's actually important to set up a user profile in NVivo. And there are a couple of reasons for this. It has to do with the way it saves your backups. As long as it can help to identify you, especially if you're working across the cloud, it's actually critical for you to have a user profile because some of the files will actually be identified by that user profile, and they'll have an appendix in the file name that helps either your IT department or you restore files if you need it to. Also, if you're working in groups, the user profiles can be used to compare analysis by different coders. However, if the user profiles are not set up and you have multiple coders analyze the same data set in NVivo, without the profile data, you would need to calculate inter-rater reliability using some other method and not the built-in NVivo platform that exists to calculate those kappas. So if everyone wants to launch it and set up their user profile, feel free to do that now. It usually takes a little while to load compared to some other programs. Usually when you launch, on the first launch, it'll ask you for the user profile. After that, if you'd like to, you can go to File in the top left corner and then Options. And there, under the General tab, which is what you see on the screen, you're able to set up or confirm your user identity. So another thing that people find important is setting up automatic saving for your projects. Because as you can imagine, once your project grows and you have multiple transcripts and multiple coders, depending on the nature of your project, it may be important to make sure that you're saving at regular intervals. I personally find the 15-minute default to be a little too frequent. So you're also in the same options section under the notifications tab, you're able to adjust that to your liking. And I would also check the box to enable deletion confirmation messages. That assures that if you attempt to delete something, it'll always ask you before you do so, before it deletes it. So I have some exploration exercises based on the sample project that is preloaded in NVivo. I'm working in NVivo 12. I've worked in 11 and 10 and 9 before, and they all have actually used the same sample project, though they've added more multimedia more recently. So if you're one who's going to work while we talk, please feel free to click on the sample project. So I think some other important things to highlight about the NVivo workspace is that the workspace is a little bit different than something like Microsoft Word. So when you open, this is what you see. And I'll just highlight the areas that I think are important to understand. The very top, you'll see shaded in green, a dynamic ribbon. This ribbon is always present. But what's important to remember is that depending on what you click on and make the active window, this green bar actually changes. So the options available to you are not always visible and have everything to do with what NVivo thinks you're working on. So always clicking on what you want to work on before you attempt an activity is important, because the options will actually be completely different depending on what it is that you're working on. Next, shaded in blue, is the navigation panel. And here you can actually find access to most of the things that you would upload into NVivo. So your files, as well as anything that you create. So the things you'll be creating as analytic products will be your nodes or codes, as well as any memos or annotations or visualizations that you create in the software. Those are all accessible in this left navigation bar. And then the general workspace is the area that's highlighted in yellow. So I'll point out a couple of other things before we move on. You'll see in green where it says detail list, that there are actually different views for this workspace. Like if you can click around, if you're playing, you can see how the main yellow window changes based on whether or not you're in a navigation view or a detail view. So many people work in NVivo and then they think they've lost something because they've accidentally clicked out of a certain active work area. So just keeping in mind the way the toolbars, the ribbon is dynamic and the tools change depending on what NVivo thinks you're doing is important. The last thing I'll point out on this slide is if you look, though it's shaded in yellow, you can see pieces of a practice transcript from the sample project. you'll notice that Henry and Barbara, Henry is the interviewer and Barbara is the interviewee, that their names are bolded, which is a specific heading style in Microsoft Word. By using formatting in Microsoft Word, such as headings and normal text, that can actually facilitate some automatic coding later, as opposed to putting everything in as just text without headers and no separation. So I have a couple of things that I'll ask you to click around in the sample project for those following at home. So if you go to the files in the navigation panel, what types of files do you see there? You can type in the chat. Is everyone able to find the files or the navigation panel? So interviews. And if you click on cases, how many cases do you see? No cases. It looks like maybe it would be if I share the sample project. So in the sample project, people mentioned finding the interviews, and you can see who some of the interviewees are by clicking here. You go in the navigation panel, click cases. There are no cases, which someone answered in the chat. And then if you click on nodes, several of the nodes, like attitude, have a plus. So if you click on that, you'll actually see some sub-nodes or child nodes that have been created for this particular code. So this sample project is available for you to work in and play around in. They've actually updated with each integration so that you are able to say code a Twitter file in this so that you can use all of the most up-to-date options. So any questions on sort of starting up, and then I'll take those questions now. I saw one on Stata. I do not think there is a integration with Stata, but you are able to import, you are able to import from many other statistical programs if you first convert to either Excel or a CSV or TSV file. So I'll move on to using a live NVivo file, and if you would like to, you're welcome to open your own blank project. And I will not be using the sample project for the rest of the course. Any other questions before I move on? So another important thing when you start any project, it'll actually ask you about whether or not you want it to write users to a project event log. Making sure that this is checked is critical, and you can find it under File, Project Properties, because that is the only way that you can know. And it literally keeps track of every keystroke. So it'll say, this sentence was added, a period was removed, and that probably seems silly to us, but it's one of the ways that NVivo is able to go back to a snapshot in time of a project based on that events log. So now, working with our own data, the first things we would do would be to upload data. And you would do that by going to Import and then Files. And then you can upload whatever text you'd like. When you attempt to import, it'll also ask you if you would like to create a case. If you're working at an individual correspondence of one-to-one, where one interview is one case, you'll want to check that. If you're doing something, say, organizational, and you'll have multiple sets of data for each organization, that might not be what a case is for you, which is why it's important to think about that before you upload your data. I'm going to open one of the files in the sample project. And you can see for each of the files that I have here, each of them has also been created as a case within NVivo. So this sample file, I will show a couple of things, and then I will also show you some of the other coding that's been done by other students over time in this exact same sample text. So the basics of coding. NVivo gives us lots of ways to code. Coding is how you'll spend most of your time analyzing your data. Coding, for those of you who may be familiar with tagging and social media, coding allows you to select a passage of a certain length. In this case, let's just say I'll select a paragraph, and then assign that paragraph to codes that you create or identify as a researcher. So when you read this little segment, you're asking yourself, what is this about? What is this segment about? And then you're giving it a short or pithy name to assign as a code, or NVivo, the nomenclature is nodes. Nodes in NVivo are what most qualitative researchers think of as codes. And so you can see that this sample file has been used several times, and people have come up with different codes for this exact same paragraph. So in order to show you that, I'm going to reveal all of the coding that has ever happened in this particular file. So are you able to see the coding stripes? They appear in different colors on the right-hand side of my screen. Yes. So you can see that over time, this very first section And I'll zoom in a little if that makes it easier for some. And I hope you'll also notice that I'm able to manipulate the size of all of these windows so that I can maximize what I want to see most. But this one paragraph has been coded as several things by different coders. So it's been noted as being about a provider team. It's been noted as talking about the time-limited nature of this particular experience. There's a code related to cancer taking over this person's life, etc. But for each code that's been identified, a different color has been assigned. So this is one way that allows you to not only see how codes may overlap. So if you have multiple transcripts, you might see how cancer taking over somebody's life overlaps with something like the loss of control. So this is a visual way that you would be able to do that. Likewise, in the second paragraph, this has been coded as disbelief, abrupt change, and there's a little segment of it that's been coded as lucky. So in this second paragraph, you can also see how even though it's pink, it's actually two different shades of pink. And what that tells me is that two different coders use different segment lengths to code this paragraph as being about disbelief. So if I hover over the word disbelief, you're able to see one coder, the initials SON, and it looks like they picked the entire paragraph. But then when I look here, I can also see that a second coder, SCS, only chose the last two sentences. So in addition to being able to see a different color for each theme or code identified, you're also able to see a little bit about coding density if you have more than one person coding, or if you have more than one concept identified. Now, the overall coding density, how many themes appear in a space of text, how many ideas have been collapsed into a few lines, can be seen by this gray bar, which has overall coding density. So that's not specific to one theme or one idea, but it does tell you where much of the activity, the analytical activity, is happening for this particular passage. So the ways that you're able to code include highlighting and dragging the entire highlighted section to a specific code that you've created already. You can also highlight the text, and at this bottom bar, enter something new. And if you click the check, it'll create a new code. The third way that you're able to code in NVivo is by going to the ribbon at the top. You'll see code and arrows, and you can create a new code. And you should see it appear in the list of nodes. Now, since I've moved the windows around, you may notice that my navigation panel has disappeared. You're always able to retrieve that by clicking the arrow, and it makes the other window smaller. So I'm now able to see the files, the nodes, and notice when I click on each one of these, what's in this window changes. And then the nodes that I created, comprehensive and doctor's visits, were both added to my existing node list. So if I decide I created doctor's visits, but then I see something else about providers, I may say, oh, I should just collapse that so we're not having too many categories about providers. So one way to merge codes that you've created is I might right-click on doctor's visits and cut that, and then go to provider team. I'll right-click there, and then I get some options. I can merge it into the node I've clicked on, or I can make it a sub-node of that. NVivo will ask if you want to include any links and relationships. Almost always you're going to say yes and check everything. And then it'll ask you for a new name. I'm just going to put the same. And you can see by the numbers of files and references that it has actually taken my one coded reference from doctor's visit and moved it here. So creating files, uploading files, creating codes and nodes. There are many other things that you can do with codes once you've created them. So in addition to making hierarchy, so making some codes subordinate and others dominant, you are also able to change the meanings. So let's take one of the ones that let's see. Oh, I think this is one that someone else made up. So let's take cyborg-like. I think it's a quote. But if I'm not sure what it refers to, I can actually click on the code and it'll bring up a reference to the text. And then it'll highlight for me where that code was identified. If I'm not quite sure what the other person meant by this, I might want to highlight it and then add an annotation. So you might want to ask someone to define this for the code book. And so any annotations that you make, annotations can be notes to yourself, notes to other people in your team, but they also may be definitional, like here's an annotation about poisoned, which seems explanatory. It's explaining that when people have cancer treatment, they often feel effects of toxicity. So any annotations that you create are permanently stored with the record that you're analyzing. Other things that you might want to do with codes include just collapsing two codes that are very similar. So I might say, well, this comprehensive is really about the treatment, so I don't need that by itself. So I'm going to just take comprehensive and move it to the treatment code. So now the number of references changed. It also automatically makes it a child But if I want it to be a sibling or just to make one treatment category, I can cut and then paste or merge into the selected node, and then it gets rid of comprehensive. You can also delete codes or nodes that you create if you've decided that something is redundant or you don't need it. Or in this case, where you've made a typo, you can just delete. By clicking on any node in the list, let's see, I can order them by the number of references and see that disbelief was something that was the most commonly cited so far. If I click on it, I'm able to see every reference to that particular word that has been coded. I can go to the reference. I can also see where they are in the text. And then I can also see how often it occurs in the files that it's been found in. Other common uses would be creating memos. So as you're creating nodes, you are able to define what a node is. So here you can see under node properties that the provider team has actually been defined by the coders working on this. And so it provides a pretty concise definition about what this code represents. So you're able to change this at any point. But if you wanted to, you could also write a new memo. And so it opens up a place, it's like a notepad where you're able to record your thoughts about a particular theme, and then you're able to actually link it back to the node. So you can connect it to the node that you are writing about, so that any notes that you have about a particular, your thoughts as you're writing or analyzing can always be connected, so that all of your thinking, these things can be captured in NVivo. So I think I'll pause again for questions, and then I think I'll show some of the more advanced visualization options available. Any questions about applying or creating codes, which are what you'll spend most of your time doing, annotations or memos?
There is the question in the chat, which is, what does it mean if the color extends through two paragraphs? So that's being the coding stripes.
Sure. So you can see here, I'll try to make it larger. Whoops, too large, can't see the text. But each of anything that has been coded, whether it's been by you as the user or by NVivo, there's some things that are automatically coded. Like it's automatically been assigned a file name. And so that you can see extends through the entire file. You're actually able to hide it if you'd like, because it's not really meaningful for your analysis. Where you see this treatment bar and it extends beyond the first paragraph to the second, that means that someone thought that both of these paragraphs were about treatment. And so if I went on and added this third paragraph, just for demonstration purposes, also to treatment, you should see that line extend. So you can see now that there's another, and and as long as it's close together, it'll just keep going. So it gives you some sense as to how a certain theme or idea that you've identified may be pervasive in a particular transcript, or whereas other things, like this bit about being lucky, is actually much smaller because it's only one sentence of the entire page. And so the length of the bar just indicates how often it's been used in that particular coding. Are there any other questions? No. Right now it's a lot. You can edit, delete, move, merge. Another thing you can do with nodes, as you create these nodes, and this is something that when I'm working on an active project, I do weekly, is that you are able to export the code book. And so if you export the code book, it just goes to a Word file. And you have the option to save it into the data set or have it go. You can, just as you would save anything else. And this is what it looks like. But it'll provide all of your codes as well as the definitions. You can also see if you're working and you're coding as you're reading, if you haven't defined everything, you can also see which ones you still need to provide definitions for. This can actually be very useful when teams are working together. So in coding stripes, other things you can turn them off and on depending on your preference. You can see the most recent ones only. You can see things that have been used the least, used the most, or you could select. So if you only wanted to see, say one, if you were looking through multiple files and you only wanted to see things related to dehumanization, unclick everything. And all of the other coding stripes go away. You're also able to, if you would like to spend the time, if you have multiple coders, there's a way to change the coding stripes so that they're not representing the codes, but they are representing the individual coders. You can also assign colors. So if you had, say, codes related to emotions, activities, and relationships or something, you can actually color code them so that they're all in similar or light colors. So they could be pink to purples or greens to blues. But you are able to change the color coding if you'd like.
So there's a question here about the difference between annotations and notes.
Sure. So an annotation is connected to that file or transcript. And it's just, you see the bottom of my screen here? So it's sort of like a footnote in that it'll always be appended. So even if I exported this and I said to include the annotations, it would come out as a note about that I made to myself. Where I think most qualitative researchers use memos to do more analytic thinking and descriptions. So they might start to write notes about how two different nodes are connected. And those memos can actually be the basis for some of the writing that might go into a manuscript for analysis. Oh. And I know a lot of this is really hard if you don't have any experience, but I did want to show you some of the explorations that are possible with NVivo and what some of those files might look like. So as you add codes and you're able to start thinking about relationships between codes, which would be the next step in qualitative data analysis, you're also able to create all sorts of charts and whoops, it's not moving. And these are all available in the Explore and Visualization. So you're able to create hierarchy charts, which produce both an Excel exportable file that shows you the frequency of something occurring, as well as creates this visual that tells you which of your nodes and child nodes are occurring more often. People actually find this often useful when you want to compare groups. So say if you divided your data set with classifications based on gender, you can actually look at this by gender identity, female or male or non-binary. Using word frequency queries, you can also create things like word clouds, where the largest words are the words that occur more frequently in your transcripts. You can create cluster diagrams that show how the codes that you've been assigning cluster together in different transcripts. You can also create mind maps, and you can also start your code list in NVivo with a mind map, where you make the mind map first, and then ask it to use these as your nodes. You can also play around with the different codes and try to identify their relationships. This is an example of looking at data by a demographic group that was added as a class or classification. And so you can see visually how the codes and the coding frequency varied by age group in this particular data set. And that's evident in the color bars. Whereas in this particular data set, the people who are 50 to 64, we're talking about housing more than the other age groups. And then lastly, you can also upload open-ended items from your survey questions into NVivo. And you're able to keep more closed-ended questions as categories for classification if you want to stratify your qualitative findings later. And so those are all screenshots of things that you're able to do in NVivo. Any questions, or is there anything specific on the ribbon that you'd like for me to explore in our 2 minutes? So codes as themes. So in NVivo, when you're creating your nodes, you're usually starting with a short list, and some people may have a priori codes that they come to the work with. If you're using a specific theory, you may have codes that you're starting with, and you may add to those as you're reading your data. But then you can also start to, once you start merging the codes and making smaller grouping. So if you have 100 codes, that's way too many to report on. So you might start to collapse that 100 into, say, 20, so that you group some of those 100 and you start to think about the relationships between them. Are they linear relationships? Are they of a like kind, but thinking about different. And so once you start to explore the relationships between the codes, you might want to do that just by thinking, but you could also use some of the visualization tools. You would then start to create themes, and you're able to show how those themes are connected, but you're also able to create networks if you want to explicitly make connections between themes. And you can create a matrix where you define a theme and say which of the subcodes are encompassed in this one theme, and then have text that is brought out as an example in the matrix of that theme. So if you combined, for example, dehumanization with like a loss of time in the cancer example we were looking at, you could actually have a theme around getting back to normal life. And then you might show how it really includes these 3 codes that were identified in the data. So some of that is the analytic work that you have to do, and the software can support your work in moving from codes to themes by highlighting connections for you. I hope that helps.
All right, well, thank you so much. I just want to point out, it's in the chat, but a recording of this will be posted with the BEAD Core website, which is just beadcore.jhu.edu, and our YouTube channel, and the link will be sent if you've registered. We'll send you that link tomorrow so that you can review this as you continue to move forward. And of course, reach out to the BEAD Core anytime if you have qualitative or other research support needs. And we are here to help. And so thank you so much, Dr. S. There's a bunch of folks as they're taking off for their next meetings writing thank you in the chat. Very informative and very appreciative and grateful to you for being here today.
Thank you.